Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming back for the second webinar of our fall application webinar series. We are so excited that so many of you are joining right now. And last week, or when was that? 2 weeks ago, when we had our first webinar, we had so many people. And I hope the information we shared was interesting and helpful and relevant for you all as you're helping either your child, your student, or yourself go through the college application process. My name is Jamie Cambra. I am our district-wide college and career COSA, Counselor and Special Assignment, and I assist all of our counselors with college and career readiness to support all of our students district-wide. So this webinar is open to all students in our district. We intentionally invited 11th and 12th graders as this is most pertinent for you all. I know seniors are applying to college right now. Juniors are thinking about it and just planning ahead. So that's always smart to get a lens from a year out so you can plan appropriately. Tonight, we are talking about out-of-state and private college admissions and campuses. But before we switch over to that, I just wanted to invite you to review our overall webinar flyer so you can see what we have coming next. So if you can calendar ahead, October 1st is our next webinar. We'll talk about test optional, test required, the college admission testing policies and practices that different campuses have. It's very varied across the state and the country. And there's just a lot of good information, I think, that will be relevant for this cycle of admission. So that webinar is at 6 o'clock. So that's a little different than the other ones have all been at 5 p.m. So it's an hour later, and that's to accommodate our presenters. So we hope you can join us for October 1st. And then the other dates are October 3rd, October 22nd, and December 4th. So this flyer and this information is posted on our college and career website, on our district website. We have a college and career events subpage. So all this information is posted there, and that's also where you will find the recordings and the presentations. As you're aware, this is a webinar format, so that means that you all can see us and hear us and learn from the information we're sharing tonight. We do have a Q&A feature on the bottom of the screen. If you have questions that you want to ask the presenters throughout the presentation, you can use the Q&A feature. Ask the question, and as quickly as we can, we will respond to your question. Sometimes if we get a lot of the same questions, we will hold on those and at the very end do an open live Q&A with our presenters so that we can talk through some of the questions that you've asked. This will be recorded and post on the college and career events page, as well as the slide deck. So if you have to leave early, or if you have a friend that wasn't able to make it, or you just want to review the information with your child later, you can always access the links on those websites. And now I'm excited to introduce our panel tonight. We're joined by University of Utah and USC, the West Coast USC, University of Southern California. First, I want to introduce Megan Horn. She's the Senior Admissions Counselor for University of Utah. We also have Rocco Blum. He is our Senior Assistant Director of Admission and a great colleague that we work really closely with at the University of Southern California. So thank you for being here, Rocco and Megan. We're also joined by Melissa Hernandez-Sear, counselor at La Costa Canyon High School, one of my dear friends. So she's going to help me kind of frame the conversation for you all from the counselor lens before we pass it off to Rocco and Megan. And then myself, Jamie Cambra, and I already introduced myself. So again, thank you all for being here. And we wanted to start the conversation of looking at out-of-state and private campuses by working with our students and families to understand why. Why do our kids consider these opportunities? And what is a value that you can consider when looking out of state or at private colleges? We had our session a few weeks ago about the UC and Cal State campuses. In California, we're very fortunate that we have a wide variety and large number of public institutions within our own state that offer tuition that can be viewed as affordable, a lot of different majors, different levels of admission, selectivity. So in our own state, there's a lot of opportunity. However, a lot of students are more and more increasingly looking out of California to attend colleges out of state. A lot of our kids are keeping to the West Coast still, but they're still looking out of state. And in that category, out of state public and private. And then as well as also staying in California and looking at private colleges that offer different opportunities as well. So some of the things to consider that we've heard from our students, that's why they're seeking these options. Different majors, even though, like I said, California has a lot of different majors that usually align with the industry sectors of where we live, right? The purpose of college is that we're preparing our students for the surrounding industry and jobs and the workforce. And if depending where you live in our country, there's different industry sectors. So a lot of kids look to go to different states that may have different majors, that may have different focus opportunities, that may have different industries that live in those communities where they have a better chance of employment once they come from a specific university. Some colleges are really proud of their class sizes that are pretty small considering, and sometimes comparatively to our public colleges in California. A lot of freshmen or first year classes are in the 20s and 30s at many campuses, and a lot of students value that. So that's something that's specific to a student's interest. Just getting away from home in a different environment and moving, like literally moving away from home and getting out and trying something new, of course, is always something a lot of students are interested in. I will say it seems like a lot of kids are interested in that in the beginning of the process where they're applying and they're excited and they're ready to go. And then maybe by the end of where they find out where they're admitted and graduation is getting close, a lot of our students tend to decide, like, I don't know if I want to go as far away. And maybe they consider different opportunities at that time. Some of the colleges have specialized programs, nursing, engineering. Maybe they have a cartooning program. Maybe they have an aeronautical program. And that's a reason a lot of our kids look at these specific programs. And then also different admissions practices. So the UCs and the Cal States use different ways to admit students. Some have a more holistic approach. Some are looking at specifically classes taken and grades earned. So a lot of the colleges, and the two that we'll hear from tonight, have different ways of evaluating an application. So it's really helpful to know when you're applying to colleges of how you're going to be evaluated. And so you want to take that into consideration. And now I'm going to pass it off to Melissa to add to the conversation.
Hi, good evening. As Jamie introduced me, good evening. My name is Melissa Hernandez Sear, and I am a school counselor at La Costa Canyon High School. I have proudly supported students with the entire college application, both on the West Coast and the East Coast, as a school counselor for many years now. Our district counselors, I'm proud to say, are also very familiar with the vast interests our students have when it comes to applying to four-year institutions. We have many students who are interested specifically in our California public schools. And as Jamie mentioned, our webinars are upcoming webinars. But if you missed our webinar last week, I do encourage you to review that presentation for any of your students that are interested in the University of California and the Cal State system. And so you can research that webinar and seek that webinar at our SDUHSD College and Career webpage. But we also have many eager students that are casting their net wide when selecting an interest list of schools, and that can include private and out-of-state opportunities. We are seeing that each year increase more and more, which is exciting. It also gives us an opportunity to learn all the variety of colleges that are across the United States. As you can see on this slide, there are over 5,000 colleges and universities across the US. Just today alone, I was able to meet with a university that has 2,000 students, very small, but they were here visiting, meeting with some of our students that were interested. So we have 5,000 students, colleges and universities that are there and available for your students to research. So choosing a university list is very personal to each student based on their specific interests, future choices that they are looking into. And so it's super important for your student to find that right fit for them. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at considerations for private versus public and in-state versus out-of-state, you're first and foremost starting with that list of schools that students are looking into and putting them into those categories of safety, target, and reach, and really diving in to see if this is a school where I will have an easier opportunity getting in based on my GPA and my possible test scores, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Or is this more of a reach school where they have a lower acceptance rate, more competitive application process? And so knowing that there are many things to consider, it is really important for your student to have a robust safety, target, and reach list. and in particular when they're looking at private and out-of-state public schools. And so when we look at these considerations, first and foremost, of course, tuition is one thing that we look at. And so it is important that families are discussing this topic up front, sitting down and having that conversation so that you're trying to, especially with, private institutions, tuition is the same for all students versus with out of state, our California residents will need to focus on the non-resident tuition pricing when they're looking at the cost for schools. And so students and families have to sit down and look at the costs that are involved with attending private and out-of-state schools versus the in-state option. And then also looking at additional things to consider, such as room and board, fees, and supplemental spending that can go into travel costs. And also just being away from home and additional spending that may not happen if they had a local option. And so really understanding the FAFSA and financial aid process and what that looks like for each institution. And there are private schools that also look at the CSS profile. And so understanding what the tuition requirements are for each school and their financial aid process, because that is a really important thing to look at, especially with out-of-state schools. You'll hear that some of our students will talk about the WUI schools, and that is a great opportunity that University of Utah and Megan will talk about more. And then with private, with the CSS profile and what that means, what schools are looking for there, but really engaging in not being afraid to leaning into the financial aid information and how to make a school maybe more affordable for your student. In addition is distance away from home. How far do you want to live from North County, California, from San Diego if you're traveling? If you're remaining here, this is home base after high school. Can you access local airports easily to come home when your student is homesick or during holidays, and how often and how much is that going to cost? In addition, not to forget to familiarize yourself with weather, the year-round weather, not just thinking about maybe how beautiful it is in the spring if that's when you visited, or during the summer, but really understanding the year-round weather and the local environment. And then lastly, looking at admission requirements for each school. Each school does have their own admission requirements necessary. So does this private institution or out-of-state institution have additional academic coursework necessary that is separate or above and beyond what is required through the A through G that we follow here in our district and in California? So knowing and understanding that, and that can mean, is it an extra year of math or an extra year of science? Also, testing. So if that school is requiring any testing requirements such as SAT or ACT. So our California public schools are test blind, which means that they do not accept SAT or ACT. But is the private institution or the out-of-state institution also a test blind institution? Are they a test optional, which if you have it, you can submit it if that is part of the application process that you are interested in, or are they requiring the test scores to be submitted? So knowing what those deadlines are for those requirements. And then essays and supplemental essays, because many of our schools will require additional essays, especially major specific supplemental essays. So really knowing when you're building your list, if they're doing it on Common App or if they're applying directly to the school, if those universities are asking for the initial school essay as well as supplemental. So really understanding what those considerations for each institution that your student is applying to, and knowing how many of those obligations and of those assignments that they may have for each school that they're considering. Next slide. And so we are excited that every one of our school sites does have college application support. This is an example here at LCC where we have Common App workshop coming up for our students at LCC. And it's going to be run and supported by Dulce Garcia from the University of San Diego on October 16th. It's going to be held starting at lunch, and it could run through lunch and into, many of our seniors will have a free 6th or 7th period, so they can do that and work into their free period if they have it. And then we also have a MiraCosta College ambassador who's here weekly from 11 to 1, and students can sign up to meet with the MiraCosta College ambassador and ask questions that range anywhere from MiraCosta to community college process to transferring to a four-year college, as well as even financial aid information. And then for all application support, your district counselors, your LCC counselors, we are here to help your student during this exciting, very exciting time. But we also know that it's filled with lots of questions and lots of stress for them. And so we want to be able to be here and know that we are supporting them so they can make an appointment with us so that we can have the time uninterrupted and meet with them as many times as we need to, also to help them with their application. And if you look on the side of the slide, it says, "Attention juniors and seniors, please join us for college visits." And this is really a really golden opportunity that we are fortunate to have in our district, where we have reps like Rocco and Megan that come to our schools and talk one-on-one with our students. And so we encourage you strongly to have your student please come and sign up for the college visit so that they can meet their local college rep, who will be most likely reading their college application, and have that opportunity to ask any questions that they have if they are on the fence of adding the school on their list, applying, or even right now when they're actually in the middle of the application process, they can help answer those questions. So I know for LCC, we have all that information on our website, and there's a QR code there for our students. Next. So thank you so much for being here this evening, and I would love to now turn this over to Megan Horn from the University of Utah, where she will be talking about out-of-state college campuses. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good evening.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Melissa. Like Jamie mentioned, my name is Megan. I'm a senior admissions counselor at the University of Utah. If you're not familiar with the University of Utah at all, we are a state-funded or a public university located in Salt Lake City, Utah. So not too far away, but a little bit of a different climate than I guess you all are used to. So, things like skiing, right? Skiing is a big draw for us as the University of Utah, as well as hiking, mountain biking, rock climbing, things like that. So that's just one reason a lot of students will like to leave their home state to just get in a different environment, have a different experience, different than what they grew up with. So what I'm going to talk about today is ways that we have at the University of Utah to help cut down on those out-of-state tuition costs. So I'm sure you're aware, at a state-funded university, we do have to charge in-state and out-of-state tuition. And so out-of-state tuition can be kind of expensive. At the University of Utah, we really like our out-of-state students, so it's a priority we make to create some pathways for students to be able to come and save some money on what can be really expensive out-of-state tuition. So that's what I'm here to talk about today. Now, you'll see the map with the states on the west side of the United States that are highlighted in red. So those are what we consider to be Western states. Now, as residents of Western states, you have the opportunity to potentially be considered for the Western Undergraduate Exchange Program. That's kind of a mouthful, so we like to call it the WUI Scholarship for short. Now, the WUI Scholarship can be a little bit tricky because a lot of schools in these states offer this scholarship, but every school has their own requirements, stipulations, eligibility, or amount of these scholarships they can award. So I'm just going to speak to how we consider students for this scholarship at the University of Utah. But if you're looking at other schools, make sure to look for their eligibility and requirements as well. So at the University of Utah, to qualify for the WUI Scholarship, a student must be, one, a resident of a Western state, a permanent resident of a Western state. They must have a 3.3 GPA or higher at the time of application. So that needs to be a cumulative, unweighted 3.3 on a 4.0 scale by the time they apply by the scholarship deadline, which is December 1st of their senior year. So if a student does have a 3.3 or higher, they apply by December 1st, and they are a permanent resident of one of these states. This is a scholarship that goes to everyone that qualifies for or meets the proper eligibility requirements, which I have mentioned. Now, how it works, it's technically a tuition discount program. So, meaning instead of paying the full out-of-state tuition rate, a student is going to be paying 1.5 times the rate of in-state tuition. So that does cut that out-of-state tuition by more than half. So this is a very affordable way for a student to be able to leave their home state and save some money on that out-of-state tuition. It is renewable for up to 4 years. It does include all majors at the University of Utah. So definitely an excellent way to save some money. Now another, I guess, option our out-of-state students have to save some money on that out-of-state tuition is by establishing residency in the state of Utah. Now, this is also going to vary a lot by state. Each state has their own residency requirements. So the state of Utah is actually, I think, the second easiest state to become a resident of. I think the first is North Dakota and the third is South Dakota. So we're right there in the middle of the top three. How this works is a student needs to be physically present in the state of Utah for 12 continuous months. Now, we have a residency office on campus to kind of, I guess, dictate or moderate this process. And so they do need to prove that. There's a few different ways they can do that, and I won't jump into those too much. Usually attending classes full-time on campus counts that, but they do expect students to document the time they leave the state. I believe they allow 29 days to leave the state. That being said, there are a few loopholes with that. So if a student, for example, wants to do an internship in Washington, D.C., if they're getting university credit for that, it counts as their time in Utah. If they are doing an internship even in their home state, but they're getting college credit for it, it counts as their time in Utah. If they are doing a study abroad, it counts as their time in Utah, as long as they're getting college credit from the University of Utah for that time. But again, if they do want to stay in Utah for the 12 months, they want to stay for the summer so they could do hiking and biking and mountain climbing, whatever. All of our summer term courses are offered at the in-state tuition rate, which is really nice. So a student needs to be physically present in the state of Utah for 12 continuous months. They need to prove financial independence. All that means is the student's parents can't claim them as a dependent on their tax forms for the year they're living in Utah. We don't care who pays the tuition, who pays the phone bill, anything like that. It all just comes down to who claims them as a dependent on their taxes. So a student does need to file for their taxes independently for the year they're living in Utah. They need to establish Utah ties. So that's considered to be getting Utah driver's license or other form of state ID, registering to vote. They don't actually have to complete the voting process, but they just need to be registered to vote and registering their car in the state of Utah. If the student has a car registered in their name, if they don't have a car or the car is not registered in their name, it's registered in a parent's name or anything like that, they don't need to worry about the car. After that, they fill out a residency reclassification application, and they are then considered a resident of the state of Utah. So ideally how this works is a student will come and pay out-of-state tuition for year 1 and then pay in-state tuition for years 2, 3, 4, and beyond. Now, while I don't always work with California students, I do work a lot with students from the state of Idaho, which is a Western state, right? So I talk about both of these programs a lot, and a big question I get is, can a student do their first year on the WUI scholarship and then establish residency? And the answer is unfortunately no, because the WUI scholarship is contingent on the student remaining a resident of their home state. So as soon as you pay that WUI tuition, you're considered a resident of California for that entire semester. It doesn't count as your 12 months in Utah. So then the other question I get is, which is going to save a student more money? And that can be kind of tricky too, right? Because WUI only covers 4 years. So if a student is doing a program like mechanical engineering, for example, they're probably looking at more of a 5-year program. And that 5th year, they'd have to pay out-of-state tuition. So they would have saved money establishing residency in the first place. So, and at the same time, paying that first full year of out-of-state tuition can be really hard financially for some families. So both have their pros and their cons. I always encourage students to chat with their admissions counselor about that. This is something we talk about a lot. As you can imagine, we attract a lot of out-of-state students because of both of these programs, especially students from the Western states. Actually, 45% of our students at the University of Utah are from outside of the state of Utah, which is really cool. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Now, I'm going to talk about the application process. So our out-of-state students apply to the University of Utah through the Common App. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the Common App, but if you haven't, just a quick rundown is it's an application system that's used online where a student goes, creates a profile, fills out some information, and they can use this to apply to multiple universities throughout the United States. At the University of Utah, the two things we require for a student to consider them for admission is that application completed on the Common App and their official high school transcripts or a record of their grades and their academic performance in high school. So the student sends in the application on the Common App, and the high school counselor sends in their official transcripts. We need those two things before we can officially consider a student for admission at the University of Utah. Now, while those are the only required things, there are some optional things students can supplement with their application as well. So those include personal essays. Like I said, they're not required, they are optional, but they can be a great opportunity for students to let us as admissions counselors or application readers know a little bit more about themselves. I think this is especially valuable if a student struggled in high school for one way or another. If they were in a car accident and they broke both of their arms and they couldn't type and their teachers didn't understand, we'd like to see an essay that tells us a little bit more about that. We like to see letters of recommendation. While we're not a super letters of recommendation heavy school, they can be helpful, especially if a student has struggled academically, to kind of speak more to their ability to succeed as a student. So letters of recommendation from teachers, counselors, coaches, employers, advisors of any kind, we will consider letters of recommendation as well. Now, the University of Utah is test optional. We've seen that most students take the ACT or the SAT during their junior year, so it's probably more than likely that you have taken one of these tests. And I like to say, if you feel really good about your score, you're really proud about your score, you can submit it to the University of Utah and we will consider it as a part of your application. However, it's not required. If you choose not to submit a test score, it doesn't hurt your chance of admission or scholarships because we don't consider test scores for merit-based scholarships at all. So that's important to note as well. I talked about this a little bit with the WUI, but the most important deadline our freshmen students need to apply, or our high school seniors need to remember, is they need to apply by December 1st if they want to be considered for merit-based scholarships, which does include the WUI. As you can imagine, we have to be really careful about how we award scholarships. So this is a very strict deadline. A student needs to have that application in by December 1st to be considered for merit-based scholarships. Okay, now if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about how we consider applications. So at the University of Utah, we don't have a minimum GPA requirement, so we do a holistic review process, meaning we have primary factors and secondary factors that we consider. I tell students the big thing we want to see is that they're going to be a successful student at the U, and there's more than one way for them to show us that. So primary factors are going to be academic performance, right? We're an academic institution. Obviously, we care about their academic performance. So we will be looking at their transcript from their high school to look at their academic performance, but we look at a lot more than just GPA. So we pay attention to what kind of courses the student take, because maybe they have a lower GPA because they took more rigorous classes. We pay attention to maybe they really struggled at the beginning of high school because they moved and they had a hard time adjusting, and that affected their academic coursework, right? We'll pay attention to grade trends. So if a student struggled at the beginning and then created some habits and did better as their high school career went on, we will pay attention to that. And then the secondary factors, I like to say, since a student is more than just their grades, if they don't feel like their grades portray their success as an individual, they have the opportunity to share secondary factors with us to show us other areas in their life where they have been successful. So I talked a little bit about the personal essay. That's a great way for students to tell us a little bit more about different areas of their life they've been really successful in, but they have the opportunity to put other things on the application as well. So if they've been involved in any extracurricular activity, so if they're in student government, if they play tennis or run cross country, if they're in their school's musical or the choir, the band, anything like that. They're in any clubs, they're in the Future Business Leaders of America, something like that. If they have any, opportunities outside of school in their community, if they're involved in a church group, if they work part-time at their local Subway, if they were a nanny for a summer, anything like that, we like to see on the application as well. Now, students have the opportunity to put any family responsibilities, right? If they have to work to help supplement their family's income, they can include that. That gives us a little bit more context to maybe they weren't as successful academically because there's a lot of stress in the home for them to work more and, bring home a paycheck for their family. Students also have the opportunity to put any physical or mental health issues that they experience on the application. I like to say we don't want students to put more than they are comfortable sharing, but if they feel like some of that information is important for us to know, give some context to their academic performance, then we'll definitely consider that and they can put that on the application. So I would say the more information you can give us, the stronger application will be, because the weakest application is a blank application. Now, I say all that not to scare you all away from the University of Utah, because we are not a super competitive school. I will say that. While our average GPA is getting close to 3.7 for incoming freshmen, because our students just keep doing better and better every year. Our admissions rate, we're sitting at about 85%. So we definitely admit way more students than we deny, but we're not open enrollment like some institutions are. So not incredibly competitive, but we do want to see our students have the potential to succeed academically at the University of Utah. So for the last slide, I want to talk about just other scholarship opportunities for our out-of-state students. So I talked about the WUI, that is considered to be a merit-based scholarship. We do have some other merit-based scholarships for out-of-state students as well. However, since the WUI is a tuition discount program and it does end up saving students a lot of money, it typically ends up being the best value for our Western students. So when a student applies by December 1st, they're automatically considered for all merit-based scholarships. And then they're offered the one that is the best value to them, or going to save them the most money, right? Now that does typically end up being the WUI, since the WUI scholarship is such a great way for our out-of-state students to save money. So they just need to apply by December 1st, no separate application process. They'll be considered for all scholarships and given the one that's the best value to them. We do have some needs-based scholarships. So scholarships for students, who are sometimes first-generation college students, students who come from low-income households, things like that. They do need to complete the FAFSA in order to qualify for those. But we also offer departmental scholarships. So different departments throughout campus will offer scholarships to their students. So for example, like the sociology department offers scholarships for sociology students, and there are scholarships for students who identify as women in STEM. So those can be really good ways to supplement costs for tuition as well. Now, we have those listed on a website called Academic Works, which you can see on the slide. So I like to tell students, if they get the WUI scholarship, but it's not quite enough money that they can make it happen to come to the University of Utah, they can go scroll through some of those and see which ones they will qualify for. So those can be stacked on top of the WUI most of the time and can really help, just cover some more of those tuition costs. So that being said, 76% of our incoming students receive some sort of scholarship or financial aid. So, I mean, that's pretty good percentage wise. That's about 3 out of 4 students. So we're very proud of that. And we have a lot of excellent ways to support our out-of-state students. And so yeah, I'm happy for the chance that I got to come and talk to you all about that today.
Thank you so much, Megan. I'm sitting here listening to you, taking pictures of these slides, because Utah it's such a popular school for so many of our students. And I think almost on a daily basis, I get asked some questions about, well, is Utah are they going to accept me? Is this crazy? Everyone goes there now. So I know it's gotten a lot more popular in our region. And for rightly so, there's a lot of opportunities in Utah. So thank you so much for sharing about the WUI, talking about the majors, talking about your admission practices. I know that Brandon Gonzalez, he's our regional rep, and we on the very last slide have included his email address. But if you all, as you're listening, Utah's, I believe, coming to all of our high schools. So make sure you check those college visit lists and register to go if you're interested to talk directly to the admissions reps during those college visits. And next up, we are going to introduce Rocco, or reintroduce Rocco, to talk about USC. This is always a favored presentation, and a lot of our students are so interested in USC. So Rocco, thank you for being here, and take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jamie. And thank you as well to Melissa and Sarah and everyone over at SDUHSD. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here this evening to speak with you all about admission to private universities. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the important details, some of the important hallmarks, things to know about some of the important details about how students should be thinking about being admitted to private universities, not just here in California, but across the US as well. Just one really quick disclaimer. Obviously, a lot of the information I'm going to be sharing today is going to be broadly applicable across many, many different private colleges and universities. But of course, this is my personal plea to make sure that you are doing your research, you're checking out the websites and the resources for the different schools that you're considering, because all schools do it a little bit differently, and some schools do it quite differently from others. So it's always good to understand what the specific policies and procedures and application process looks like for the specific schools that you are considering. But again, we're just going to talk about some of the different questions, some of the most commonly kind of asked about topics that we hear about when it comes to admission to private universities. So firstly, to talk a little bit more about kind of the application process in general. So there are, when it comes to admission to private colleges, kind of a few different kind of key things that I wanted to highlight about how the process can work, what things look like. Again, going to be speaking broadly about private universities in general. There will be a slide at the end where I'll talk a little bit more specifically about USC and how we do things, in case there might be any questions about that. And Megan touched on this a little bit before, but one of the hallmarks of admission to many private universities is this idea of the holistic application review. And this is something that USC has embraced over a number of years, as well as many other universities too. This idea that we're interested in considering many different factors when we're going through our review process. We don't believe that we can get the information we need from just one thing, whether that's the grades or the essays alone. We're interested in considering many different things because we believe that's going to give us the fullest picture of each student applying, to allow us to get to understand who they are, not just as a student, but as a person and as a potential community member at our school. So many schools, to that end, in that holistic process, will not have kind of things like a minimum GPA or a minimum test score for admission. USC, again, is one of those schools. So holistic, again, is really designed to make the process a little bit more nuanced, complex, and really kind of honor sort of the diverse and unique things that each student is bringing to the application process. This idea of territory management is important as well. This idea that at many private universities, the way that admission counselors divide up the work is that we actually work with specific geographic territories, whether that's here domestically in the US or abroad as well. Some schools will have dedicated international admission teams that will work with students applying from abroad. So for example, I'm actually fortunate enough to be the admission counselor at USC that works with students from North County, San Diego. So I have the pleasure and privilege of actually reviewing applications for all of the high schools in SDUHSD. And I will actually also be visiting, I believe, most, if not all, of those high schools in just a few weeks' time. So really, really excited for that. The reason I like to highlight that here is because in that holistic process, we really value this idea of considering context, understanding that students applying from different schools, different cities, states, countries, places are going to have different opportunities available to them. And we want to be able in our process to honor those differences and to understand what opportunities are and are not available to each student who's applying, because then we can consider that context, consider those differences as we're going through our holistic review process. And again, that ties into the next point about context. Context really is key in that holistic review process. It's very important for us to be able to understand the context from which a student is applying as we're making those admission decisions. Another important piece are letters of recommendation. Again, all schools do it differently here, but we find at USC that letters of recommendation can actually be a really helpful way for us to learn more about the student who's applying from the perspective of an important adult in their life, whether that's a school counselor, a teacher, a mentor outside of school, a coach, some other figure in their life that knows them and is going to be able to speak to us kind of from that third-party perspective about who that student is, what they're passionate about, what their contribution contributions have been to their community and what contributions as well they're looking to make to their college community if admitted to. So we find letters of recommendation can oftentimes be a useful tool for a lot of schools to be able to kind of get that third-party perspective that we obviously can't get from the student because that's a first-party perspective. When it comes to the application process too, there are a number of different, what I like to call kind of plans that schools will offer that allow students to apply in different ways and by different deadlines. So the three that always come to mind and always come up in conversation that schools will offer or not offer are early action, early decision, and regular decision. I often get asked about the difference between early action and early decision. It's an important distinction to make because there are some key differences. A couple of the biggest is that early action is typically a non-binding application plan. And what that means is that students typically who are admitted early action are not bound to attend the school that admits them early action if they are admitted. They are still able to keep their options open and accept an offer from another school. Whereas on the other hand, early decision is typically a binding plan where students will sign some sort of early decision agreement with the university that they're applying to, stipulating that they will withdraw all their other applications if admitted and elect to attend that school that admitted them early decision. So the other kind of key difference there, early action, it is typically, though not always, non-restrictive, meaning that schools, students that is, can typically apply to multiple colleges and universities' early action plans, whereas early decision, because it is binding, is typically restrictive in that it does only allow students to apply to one school with an early decision round. There are, of course, some exceptions. Some schools offer REA, or restrictive early action, so that can sometimes be something that's worth researching if the school you might be considering does offer that. And then regular decision is exactly what it sounds like. It is typically a later deadline after, of course, our early deadlines, early action, and early decision. Merit scholarships, I think, are an important thing to mention as well. And I'll talk a little bit more specifically about how that works at USC. But merit scholarships can often be a key way that, that universities can strive to kind of offset some of the cost for students and families of a private education and to make that education just that little bit more affordable. So again, make sure that you're understanding what the merit scholarship process looks like at the schools you might be considering, if that school does even offer merit scholarships, whereas some schools don't. But merit scholarships, again, can be a very, very important tool, a very, very great opportunity for students who are applying to some of these private universities. And again, the last point I'll make, Megan did touch on this as well, but applying through the Common Application is a really, really important thing to understand about applying to many private universities. USC, like many of our peers, we are a Common Application partner school, meaning that we require students to submit their application not directly to USC, but through this portal, this tool called the Common Application. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, if we can switch over to the next slide. So with the Common Application, again, I think Megan did a pretty good job of explaining what it is, but it is essentially, I like to call it like a kind of a third-party website or a third-party portal that many colleges and universities across the US have chosen to partner with that essentially allows students to submit their application materials to multiple schools, all within one convenient place. So eliminating the need essentially for students to submit different applications to different schools on their kind of own unique application portals. So all of the students' materials, or most of the students' materials, that is, will typically be submitted through the Common Application. Just to kind of quickly go through a few of the different aspects of the Common Application and what we can learn from them. One of the things that can be really, really valuable and that we actually very much value at USC is what's called the activity summary. This is a really great place on the Common Application where students can tell us about all of the different ways that they have chosen to be involved in their school community and in their local community outside of the classroom. So this can include a lot of different things. That activity summary is going to look very different for every student applying. But like I said, it can include things in the high school context, things like varsity and junior varsity sports teams, school clubs and competitions, things of that nature. It can also include as well things outside of the school context. So things in the local community, volunteer work, community service, internships, part-time jobs, research, heavy responsibilities at home that can take up a lot of the students' time. So all of those things, and I'm sure many more that I'm not thinking of, can be really, really important for us to kind of understand how each student is involved both inside and outside of that school context. Because again, a lot of schools are looking for students who not just are going to succeed academically, but are going to become really strong and involved community members and take advantage of all the great opportunities that are going on campuses across the US. On the Common Application, there are a number, sometimes one, but sometimes more essays that typically can be required for students to complete. These can be really, really important ways that private universities can really gain some insight, not just into a student's writing skills or level of writing, how they articulate their ideas, as well as, of course, their grammar and punctuation and proofreading skills, which are all also important, but also to gain more personal insight about the student, more context that we can use to understand who the student is and where they're coming from. This can include things like the personal statement on the Common Application, which is, of course, a little bit more of a general essay where students can actually choose the prompt or make up their own. But sometimes schools, such as USC, can have other essays that might be required to gain a little bit more insight and information. In our case at USC, we have what we call the specific USC supplement, where we ask students to address, after completing the personal statement, where we ask students to address their specific interest in USC. Why are they applying to USC? Why have they selected the major they've chosen on their application, and to really zoom in a little bit and get a little bit more specific and particular about why they are interested in attending that specific university. And then finally, sometimes on the Common Application, there can be supplemental materials that are required if schools determine that there are other things that they want to see or need to see in their review process. So this can include a lot of different things. It can include additional writing pieces, a resume, a portfolio, things of that nature. So again, this is where it really comes down to understanding what the specific requirements and recommendations are for each of the universities, the private universities that you as the student might be considering. So one of the other things to consider when applying to college, particularly a private university, can be this idea of picking your major. Again, policies can look different between schools. So one of the things I wanted to address in particular, too, is this idea of should I apply with a major indicated or should I apply undecided? This is a question I get asked a lot. Again, different schools will view this differently. Some schools are perfectly fine with allowing a student to apply undecided, allowing them to not have their mind made up, to still be figuring things out and to kind of start out as an undecided student before declaring their major. Whereas some schools will require or recommend a student to indicate a major on their application when they apply. At USC, for example, we do require students to indicate at least a first choice major on the application because we want that major consideration to be part of a student's thinking as they're going through the college application process. The question that, of course, stems from that is preparation for major considered in the review process? And the answer is it can depend. There are a number of institutions, private schools, that will be kind of considering a student's prep in the context of the major that they're considering, whereas some schools don't really have or place as much weight on that particular idea. So again, understanding if preparation for major is going to be considered by the university to which you are applying. And then sometimes, based on particular majors requirements, there can also be additional pieces that are going to play a role in that determination about prep for major. One of the most common ways that can manifest is this idea of portfolios or auditions for some of those kind of more art-based programs. I think that's sort of the clearest example. But there can sometimes be kind of those art-based programs, things like theater or dance or music or cinema, where schools can sometimes ask specifically and require specifically a portfolio of work or an audition in order to evaluate and determine a student's prep and readiness and fit for one of those artistic-based majors. So that can also be something to look out for. That can sometimes be a requirement and definitely not something you want to forget because it sometimes can be a very, very important part of that review process. Next slide, please. So one of the other important things can be this idea of showing interest in a university. Some schools are very, very explicit and upfront with students that they do track what's called demonstrated interest, which means they're going to be keeping track in their system where they store applications and data of how many times a student has had certain interactions with the university, and they're going to consider that in their application review process. So that can include a lot of different things. It can include coming to visit campus and doing an info session or a tour. It can include attending a high school visit if the rep comes to your school. It can include virtual and webinar events such as this. Sometimes the schools are tracking that. So some schools find that to be an important way to kind of gauge a student's actual level of interest in a school and to be able to see that when they're reviewing the application of the student. Other schools don't place as much value in that or don't consider it at all. USC is an example of a school that does not track demonstrated interest, then it does not play a role in our application process. But again, there might be some schools that place a very high value, a very high premium on ensuring and encouraging students to find as many ways as possible to interact with that school, to be learning about that school, to be attending events and getting FaceTime with staff members, admission officers at those schools. Next slide, please. This question of affordability and financial aid, this should, and I believe it is in many cases, this should be top of mind for all families. We understand that admission to a private university is stressful enough, but figuring out affordability, that question can also be a really, really challenging conversation to navigate. So I just wanted to mention a couple of things that I think can be useful when talking about kind of how to make a private education as affordable as possible for the student and for the family. Again, policies can differ between institutions, but there are some institutions that follow what's known as a need-blind philosophy versus a need-aware or a need-considered philosophy. Need-blind is something that sort of indicates that that school is not going to take into account a student or a family's level of need when they're deciding whether or not to admit the student to the university or to the college. Whereas need-aware or need-considered is typically indicative of the fact that that institution has decided that they are going to in some level, whether it's very highly or make it a small part of their review process, that they are going to consider a student's level of need when they decide and make those admission decisions. So just keeping in mind that, again, need-blind versus need-aware institutions, there's no right or wrong answer, but understanding that if that's playing a role in the review process, you want to be aware of that because that's something, again, as you're going through the application that might kind of impact your thinking, your choices, and impact the list that the student is making in terms of what colleges they might be interested in. When it comes to submitting a need-based financial aid application, I would say the FAFSA, most, again, if not all schools are going to ask for the FAFSA, which again is a really, really important form, a really, really important way that financial aid offices at all universities, public and private in many cases, are going to determine a student's level of need. Not all schools will require this other piece, which is the CSS profile. USC is an institution that for students applying for need-based aid, you must submit both, so the FAFSA and the CSS profile. But these are essentially the tools that our financial aid office and that financial aid offices in general are typically going to use to determine a student's level and a family's level of need in the application process. Again, circling back to before, merit scholarships are a very, very important thing to consider. They are in many cases separate from need-based aid and are awarded and considered for in a completely different process and in a completely different context. And merit scholarships, the way I like to think of them, is it's sort of like a grant in a lot of ways. That is money awarded to the student that does not need to be paid back. And it's typically, and again, in the context of USC, typically that determination is made within our holistic review process to understand who are the students who are really rising to the top in the pool, not just in terms of academics, but in terms of that holistic review of all of the pieces of the application. So understanding what merit scholarships are available at the different schools you're considering, how schools are going to be looking at those, how they're going to be awarding them. Again, crucial to be understanding those details as you're kind of doing your research on different private universities. And then, of course, this is sort of, again, self-explanatory, but making sure that you are reaching out to different institutions to understand what their policies are on need-based aid. Many institutions like USC will have dedicated financial aid offices that are ready and willing to answer any questions that students and families may have about the process of applying for need-based aid. So please do not hesitate to use them as a resource. They are excellent. They're very knowledgeable of what they do, and they are ready to talk about the specific requirements for their institution, which again may differ from school to school. So always important to understand what that looks like. Next slide, please. And just a couple of other things that I think are important to note as well. One of the things that, again, a school like USC and many private universities are seeking to do is not just to bring students to campus, but to make sure that they are going to be supported and healthy and thriving once they are here. So a couple of things that I wanted to mention kind of on that point. Pretty much all schools are going to have very, very specific and targeted resources to make sure that students' different needs are going to be met while they're kind of going through their undergraduate career. So for example, at USC, we have something, an office called OSAS, which is the Office of Student Accessibility Services, that is the dedicated office on our campus to work with any student who may have a physical disability or a learning difference, and to ensure that they have the appropriate accommodations in order to be successful in all contexts, whether that's in the classroom, in the dorms, in the dining halls, accessibility around campus. They are designed, they are targeted, they are making sure that students have all of the support that they need. Again, targeted with many of the other offices and support systems that we have on our campuses. But one of the things that universities are going to be placing a really, really high emphasis on is making sure that, it doesn't just stop when we admit students to the university. We want to make sure that for the entirety of their undergraduate career, they feel supported, they feel safe, and they're going to have the resources that they need to get the most out of their experience and to be successful. One of the questions that we also get is the requirement of a language other than English, or LOTE, or LOTE for short, as I like to call it. So there are some universities where there is a language other than English requirement that might be present, whether that's in the admission process or a requirement for graduation, or sometimes both. So one of the things that can be important to know is the school you're considering, do they have that requirement for either admission, for graduation, or for both of those things? At USC, for example, we do not have a specific course or progression requirement for foreign language in our admission process. Actually, very generally, USC doesn't have any sort of specific mandated courses that we require students to have taken in their high school context in order to be admissible to USC. Nor do all majors at USC have the language other than English requirement as a requirement for graduation, though some majors do. It does depend on the program. So again, understanding what that looks like at the specific university. And again, just another thing to mention at USC about accessibility and accommodations. For students who do require accommodations at USC and who aren't able to take a traditional LOTE class, we are able to make accommodations for students to still take appropriate coursework to fulfill that requirement, even if they're not able to be or be successful in a traditional foreign language class. And then finally, just to address a question that can be pretty common as well about how to talk about an IEP in a student's application. This is where I'd really like to bring it back to this idea of the holistic application review, where we want to make sure that students, of course, know that they are never going to be discriminated against or put at a disadvantage based on what they share in their application. We want students to share what they feel comfortable with and what they feel is important to know about them. But again, I always say that more context is typically better than less context. So it can be helpful for us as admission counselors, for application readers, to understand if there have been particular circumstances that might explain some of the details that can be useful about a student's academic progression. So again, it's really up to the student, to the family, to decide what they feel comfortable sharing. But this is really a place where holistic review is going to kind of reign supreme and is going to allow us to really consider the context that we need in order to go through our kind of application review process and to make those decisions. Next slide, please. And then finally, really just to breeze through some kind of USC specific details. At USC, we like to think of there as being kind of 5 what we call key points or pillars or hallmarks of a USC undergraduate education. Distinct learning experiences. We believe that students should be able to explore all of their interests in some fashion, as well as to engage in research if they're looking to do that. We also want to make sure that students know that global perspective is very central to what we do here at USC. So again, we encourage students to take advantage of our study abroad opportunities and also to be strong community members in a really diverse student body. Those are some of the really, really important ways that we encourage our students to gain that sense of perspective. In terms of the holistic application review, that's how we do things at USC. It's very, very central to the work that we do. We find that considering context and being holistic in our thinking allows us to make the most informed decisions possible about each of the tens of thousands of applications that we receive every year. Most students will apply through the common application, though we do also participate in the QuestBridge match process as we are a QuestBridge partner school. We do offer both early action and regular decision merit scholarships, of which we do offer a pretty broad range from a few $1,000s per year all the way up to a full tuition scholarship. Those are in 95% of cases tied to early action, meaning students must apply EA if they would like to be considered for merit scholarships. The exceptions to that are students applying to any of those programs that ask for a portfolio or audition. So things like cinema, music, theater, dance, architecture, things like that. Because they do not participate in early action, they are going to have that regular decision deadline. And they will still be able to be considered for merit scholarships. And then when it comes to financial aid, as I mentioned before, USC, we are need blind. We do not consider a student's need when we decide whether or not to admit the student, and we will guarantee to meet each student's demonstrated level of financial aid, again, through a variety of different funding sources. Next slide, please. And finally, as I mentioned before, I am the admission counselor at USC that works with all of North County San Diego, including all of the SDU HSD high schools. So I am always more than happy to work with students, to work with families, to make sure all of your questions get answered. I will also be visiting, like I said, all of the SDU HSD high schools in just a couple of weeks. So I'm really excited to engage with students and counselors in person to answer questions, to have those conversations. So again, my information's here, my email address, my phone number. Email address is usually the fastest way to reach me. But again, thank you so much to all of you for allowing me to speak today, and looking forward to continuing the conversation via email if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Rocco. Wow. Every time I hear you speak, I learn something new. So thank you for this information. I really like some of the questions that came through the Q&A. Before we do a few live with you all, and I know we're kind of wrapping up at the end of our webinar, I do want to show the screen so that everyone has the contact information for University of Utah, for USC, Melissa, who's our LCC counselor. If you are not Melissa's student, which I'm sure many of you are not, you should, and you have specific questions that we may not have answered tonight, please feel free to reach out to your individual counselor. All counselor emails are posted on the counseling website of your high school. And I do want to mention tonight's intended to be like a broad overview of this information, and all of our high schools provide hands-on, one-on-one support, like Melissa mentioned, through Common App web session workshops, those college visits, or just individually meeting with your counselor. So really the biggest thing that I wanted to bring forward for the Q&A that came up in some of the questions and all of our responses was it depends. When you're looking at out-of-state colleges and private colleges, it's really hard to generalize an answer that can be true for the nearly 4,000 colleges that we have across the country and in the private sector. So doing your research and having an organized way to do it. We always recommend that students have like a Google spreadsheet where they can list the college name, list the financial aid if they require the CSS profile or the FAFSA, have different columns. What is the cost? What is the deadline? Do they offer early action? Do they offer early decision? Does demonstrated interest play a role? Do they admit by major? And if a student goes through and really does their research, they are going to be so beyond prepared for this process, and there won't be any surprises in the end. So I highly recommend that. I do have a question before we go off that I want to ask for Rocco and Megan regarding, and someone answered it in the chat too, but do you admit students by the high school they attend? I know that's a common myth out there, and there's a quota conversation. And if either of you are able to speak to that, it can be kind of a brief response. Let's go with Rocco first, if you're able to answer that question.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's sort of a tough question to answer because in a holistic review process, we're sort of juggling a lot of different considerations all at the same time. And our staff and we are professionals, so that's our job. But what I will say is that we don't have any specific quota or any particular number of students that we will always be limited to taking from a specific high school. Though one of the things that we do prioritize in our holistic review process is ensuring that we have diversity of all kinds in our admission process, including geographic diversity. So we make it an effort across the board throughout the 50 states and internationally to ensure that different areas and cities and states are all represented in a strong way, to ensure that we have students from all over on our campus, because we find that that's only going to enhance the student experience and allow for the free exchange of different perspectives and ideas. So while there isn't a specific number or quota that we'll take from specific high schools, geographic diversity is one of the priorities that we're thinking about as we're going through our review process.
Perfect. Thank you. And I know, Megan, you answered it in the chat. Do you want to chime in on your response?
Okay, sorry. So the answer is typically no. Kind of like Rocco said, there's a lot of things we need to consider, but typically we'll admit as many students as we find eligible to succeed, or like I talked about, achieve academic success. So no, we don't have a cap or anything. It's not a super big priority for us to like get so many students from each high schools or too many students from each high schools. We'll typically take as many as we find eligible.
Perfect. Thank you. And a few questions came up about the early decision, early action, and I kind of want to take a minute. Melissa, feel free to join me in this conversation. In general, for students who are applying early decision, remember that's binding. You, by submitting an early decision application, you have to sign a contract. Your parent signs a contract. Your counselor signs a contract that you understand if you're admitted to the campus, you will attend the campus. Oftentimes, the early decision deadline is before this new FAFSA deadline that we've experienced for the past 2 years, which is now December 1st when the FAFSA opens. So sometimes the early decision deadlines are November. So how can a college calculate the financial aid package? Well, they can't because the FAFSA hasn't been submitted. So a lot of colleges have been using the CSS profile for parents to submit early with the early decision application. So that's one way to answer that question, that oftentimes a school that offers early decision will request that the family submit the CSS profile because that opens October 1st. And then once you're admitted through early decision, then you would submit the FAFSA later, and they would give you a financial aid package based off the CSS profile. So I hope that answers that question. Melissa, do you want to speak to applying early action? And this will be our last question because I know we're over time. People have asked, is it an advantage to apply to early action? How would you answer that?
Yes. And this was addressed also in the chat that it is important to know when you're doing your research for the schools to really look at that particular school's acceptance rate, what the requirements are for the acceptance rate, and to know, is it in my students' best interest to apply early action based on their acceptance rate for students applying early action? Is the acceptance rate similar to that of regular decision? So just throwing it out there, if a school has a 25 or 50% acceptance rate for early action and maybe a 23 or 24% acceptance rate for regular decision, and you know that your student is already working on maybe 8 or 10 applications, then it could be something that you're sitting there negotiating with your student of maybe having them maybe apply regular decision for that particular school because it is similar in their acceptance rates. And then maybe focus on an early action application process when you know that there's a considerable difference of when we've seen upwards of maybe a 60% acceptance rate for an early action application versus maybe a 40% acceptance rate for a regular decision. When it's very glaring in that situation, then it is in the student's best interest to apply for an early action. So each school is very specific. Each school is very individual in that process. And so it goes along with the research when you're finalizing your REACH target and safety list and knowing what the early action versus regular decision acceptance rate is for that particular school.
Thank you, Melissa. And
Thank
for
you all.
questions that we did not answer or we didn't get to, we definitely invite you, like I said, talk to your school counselor. Every high school has a college and career tech. You can pop in and ask the questions as well. Thank you all for joining us tonight. A special thank you to Rocco and Megan and Melissa and Sarah for being here with us. And everyone have a great night, and we hope to see you back on October 1st at 6 p.m. Don't forget, it's an hour later. Have a good night. Thank you.